No one expected this. At 62, Johnny Depp just dropped a 2026 announcement that hit the internet like a shockwave, and fans are literally losing it. Not because it was flashy, but because it was real, raw, and completely unexpected. After years of silence, controversy, and rebuilding, this moment feels different. Something shifted, and people can feel it. But here's the thing, most headlines are missing what actually matters. What did he really say, and why are longtime fans calling this his boldest move yet? Once you hear the full story, you'll understand why everyone is screaming about this. What made this moment explode online wasn't just the name attached to it, it was the timing, the tone, and the fact that Johnny Depp didn't come back the way people expected him to. For years, people watched him from a distance, headlines going back and forth, opinions split down the middle, and yet through all of it, he stayed mostly quiet, only speaking when absolutely necessary, only appearing when it mattered. So when this announcement dropped in 2026, it didn't feel like another celebrity update. It felt like something bigger, something personal, something that had been building for a long time. People first noticed it through a short clip that started circulating online. Not a flashy trailer, not a dramatic press release, just a simple, controlled message that felt almost too calm for what it was about to trigger. His voice was steady, his words carefully chosen, and there was no attempt to oversell anything. That alone caught attention because in a world where everything is loud and exaggerated, this felt different. Fans immediately started sharing it, not because it was shocking on the surface, but because it felt real. And then the deeper meaning started to hit. Longtime supporters began connecting dots, referencing past interviews, especially the ones where he talked about stepping away, about focusing on what actually mattered to him. One particular interview clip that resurfaced was from his conversation during a press appearance where he openly said he was done chasing approval and was more interested in creating things that meant something to him personally. At the time, many people didn't fully understand what he meant, but now, in 2026, it suddenly made sense. This announcement wasn't about proving anything to critics. It wasn't about reclaiming status or trying to dominate headlines again. It was about control. Control over his story, his work, and his future. And that's exactly why fans reacted the way they did. They weren't just excited, they were emotional. Social media flooded with comments from people saying this felt like the version of him they had been waiting to see again. What made things even more intense was how unexpected the direction was. Instead of going back to the typical roles or projects people assumed he would choose, he revealed something that showed a completely different mindset. Something more independent, more personal, and honestly, more risky. And that risk is what made it powerful. Because at this stage, most people would play it safe, but he did the opposite. There were also subtle details in his delivery that people picked up on. The way he paused before certain words, the way he avoided dramatic language, the way he kept everything grounded. It didn't feel scripted in the traditional sense, even though it clearly was prepared. It felt like someone who had taken time to think deeply about what they wanted to say and how they wanted to say it. And then came the reaction from industry insiders. While fans were celebrating, many analysts started discussing what this could mean long-term. Some called it a strategic move, others called it a personal reset, but almost everyone agreed on one thing: this wasn't random. This was calculated, but not in a manipulative way, in a deliberate and thoughtful way. Another key reason why this announcement broke the internet was because it challenged expectations. People had already created a narrative in their minds about what his future would look like. They assumed a certain path, a certain comeback style, and he completely ignored all of that. Instead, he created his own lane, and that unpredictability is what made it impossible to ignore. Fans also started bringing up older moments, especially behind-the-scenes footage and past statements where he hinted at wanting to step away from the traditional system. At the time, those comments felt vague, almost like passing thoughts, but now they feel like clues that were always there. This wasn't a sudden decision, this was something that had been forming quietly over time. And what really pushed everything over the edge was how quickly the conversation spread beyond his core fanbase. People who hadn't followed his journey closely suddenly became interested. Not because of controversy, not because of drama, but because of curiosity. People wanted to understand why this moment felt so different, why it was getting such a strong reaction. Even content creators and analysts who usually stay neutral found themselves diving into the topic, breaking down his words, analyzing his tone, comparing this moment to earlier phases of his career. And almost every discussion pointed back to the same idea: this was a turning point. But here's where it gets even more interesting. While everyone was focused on what he said, very few people initially paid attention to what he didn't say. And sometimes, what's left unsaid tells you more than anything else. There were no grand promises, no exaggerated claims, no attempt to convince anyone of anything. Just a clear statement, delivered with confidence, and left open for interpretation. That silence, that restraint, created space for people to think, to analyze, to feel something real instead of being told what to feel. And in today's world, that's rare. That's why people kept replaying the clip, not because they missed something obvious, but because they felt like there was more beneath the surface. And as more details started to emerge, as more context was added, the reaction only grew stronger. What started as a simple announcement turned into a full conversation about identity, independence, and what it really means to come back on your own terms. And as the conversation kept growing, something unusual started happening. People weren't arguing the way they usually do online. They were actually listening, breaking things down, sharing clips, comparing moments from different years, almost like they were trying to piece together a story that had been unfolding quietly in the background for a long time. That shift alone says a lot, because normally anything connected to Johnny Depp instantly turns into a divided debate. But this time, the tone felt different, more reflective, more focused on understanding rather than reacting. A big reason for that was the way his message connected with something deeper than just entertainment. People started relating it to their own situations, their own moments of stepping back, rethinking priorities, and choosing a different path. It stopped being just about a celebrity and started becoming about a mindset. And that's when things really began to escalate. One clip in particular kept resurfacing across platforms, an older interview where he talked about feeling disconnected from the system, about how success sometimes comes with expectations that don't always align with who you are becoming. At the time, it sounded like a philosophical comment, something abstract, but now it feels like a direct preview of what we're seeing unfold. Fans pointed out how consistent his message has been over the years, even when the public narrative around him was constantly changing. And then came the unexpected confirmation that made everything even more real. During a recent media interaction, a verified outlet referenced his shift in direction, confirming that this wasn't just a one-time statement, it was part of a larger plan. The report highlighted how he had been working behind the scenes, focusing on projects that give him more creative freedom rather than following traditional industry structures. That detail alone validated what many fans were already sensing. This wasn't a reaction, it was a decision. What made this even more powerful was the lack of urgency in his approach. There was no rush to prove anything, no attempt to flood the market with content, no desperate comeback strategy. Instead, everything felt controlled, intentional, almost like he was setting his own pace regardless of external pressure. And in an industry that thrives on speed and constant visibility, that kind of patience stands out. People also began analyzing the language he used in the announcement. Every word felt deliberate, not overly polished, but not careless either. There was a balance between honesty and restraint that's hard to fake. He didn't try to simplify things for mass appeal, but he also didn't make it complicated. He just spoke in a way that felt grounded, and that authenticity is what people responded to. Another layer that added to the impact was how his peers reacted. While some remained silent, others subtly acknowledged the moment, either by sharing the clip or referencing it in their own conversations. Those small signals matter, especially in an environment where public support is often calculated. It showed that this announcement wasn't just resonating with fans, it was being noticed within the industry as well. And then there was the ripple effect. Once the initial reaction settled, a second wave of discussion started, focusing on what this could mean moving forward. People began speculating about the kind of projects he might choose, the kind of stories he might want to tell, and how this new approach could influence others in the industry. Because when someone with that level of recognition changes direction, it doesn't just affect them, it creates a shift in perception for everyone watching. Some analysts even suggested that this could mark the beginning of a broader trend, where established figures step away from traditional systems and start building something more personal. Whether that happens or not, the fact that the conversation is even happening shows the level of impact this announcement had. And yet, despite all the speculation, the core message remains simple. This wasn't about reinvention for the sake of attention, it was about alignment. Aligning actions with values, aligning choices with identity, and most importantly, aligning public presence with personal truth. That's why it feels different. That's why people can sense that this isn't temporary. There's also something to be said about timing. 2026 isn't just another year, it represents a period where audiences are becoming more aware, more selective, more interested in authenticity over perfection. And this announcement fits perfectly into that shift. It doesn't try to compete with noise, it cuts through it by being genuine. And interestingly, the more people tried to analyze it, the more they realized that the power of this moment doesn't come from what's visible, it comes from what's behind it. The years of experience, the challenges, the lessons, all of it condensed into a single, controlled message that doesn't need to be loud to be heard. Some fans even described it as a quiet comeback, not in terms of visibility, but in terms of presence. Because sometimes, coming back isn't about being everywhere, it's about showing up in a way that actually reflects who you are now, not who people expect you to be. And that idea is what continues to drive the conversation forward. Because at its core, this isn't just about a moment, it's about a shift in perspective. A reminder that stepping back doesn't mean disappearing, and coming back doesn't mean returning to the same place. Sometimes, it means creating something entirely new. And as more people start to understand that, the reaction becomes less about excitement and more about respect. Respect for the way it was handled, respect for the clarity of the message, and respect for the decision to do things differently, even when it would have been easier to follow the expected path. But the story doesn't stop here, because what comes next is where everything truly starts to take shape, and if the announcement itself was enough to break the internet, what follows might change the way people look at his journey completely. And that's exactly where things start to shift from reaction to realization, because once the noise settles, people begin to look closer, not just at the announcement itself, but at the pattern behind it. And when you trace that pattern back, it becomes clear that Johnny Depp wasn't just stepping into a new phase, he was closing a chapter that had been open for far too long. For years, his name carried layers of meaning depending on who you ask. To some, he was still the iconic performer who defined entire generations of film. To others, he became a symbol of controversy, of headlines that overshadowed his work. But what makes this moment so powerful is that it doesn't try to erase any of that. Instead, it acknowledges the weight of the past without being controlled by it. People began revisiting older footage again, not out of nostalgia this time, but out of curiosity. They wanted to understand how someone evolves under that level of public pressure, how someone maintains identity when everything around them keeps shifting. And in multiple past interviews, he hinted at something that now feels central to this moment, the idea that public perception is temporary, but personal direction is permanent. One widely shared clip from a previous press interaction showed him talking about how he values creative freedom over commercial expectations. He explained, in a calm but firm tone, that he would rather be part of something meaningful than something predictable. At the time, that statement didn't trend, it didn't spark massive reactions. But now, in 2026, it feels like a key piece of the puzzle. And then came the deeper layer of confirmation. Industry reports began highlighting that he had been quietly building connections outside the usual system, collaborating with smaller creative teams, exploring projects that don't rely on massive budgets or traditional distribution channels. This wasn't speculation anymore, it was backed by credible mentions in media coverage, reinforcing the idea that his announcement wasn't a sudden pivot, it was the result of consistent, behind-the-scenes effort. What really stands out is how intentional everything feels. There's no sign of randomness, no scattered moves, no attempt to test multiple directions at once. Instead, it's focused, almost minimal. And that minimalism is what makes it powerful, because it suggests clarity. It suggests that he knows exactly what he wants to do, and more importantly, what he doesn't want to do. Fans started picking up on the clarity as well. Instead of asking questions like what is he trying to prove, they started asking what is he trying to build. And that shift in questioning changes everything, because it moves the conversation from doubt to curiosity, from skepticism to engagement. Another interesting detail that kept coming up was the emotional tone of his announcement. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't overly sentimental, but it carried a sense of calm confidence that's hard to ignore. It felt like someone who has already processed the difficult parts and is now ready to move forward without needing validation. And that's where the strongest reactions started coming from. Not from shock, not from hype, but from recognition. People recognized the tone, because it reflects a kind of growth that doesn't need to be explained in detail. It just shows through actions, through choices, through consistency. Even critics, who would normally approach this kind of moment with caution, found it difficult to dismiss. Not because they suddenly changed their views, but because the approach itself didn't give them much to challenge. There were no exaggerated claims, no controversial statements, no obvious angles to push back against. Just a clear, grounded message that stands on its own. And then there's the question of impact. Not just immediate impact, but long-term influence. Because moments like this don't just fade away, they set a tone. They create a reference point for future decisions, both for the individual and for the audience watching. Some analysts pointed out that this could redefine what a comeback looks like. Instead of returning with maximum visibility and aggressive promotion, it shows that there's another way, a quieter, more controlled approach that focuses on substance rather than scale. Whether others follow that path or not, the example is now there. And what makes it even more compelling is the fact that it doesn't rely on perfection. There's no attempt to present an ideal version of reality. It feels honest, even slightly imperfect, and that's exactly why it resonates. Because people don't connect with perfection, they connect with authenticity. There's also a strategic element that shouldn't be ignored. While the message feels personal, it's also incredibly effective in terms of positioning. It redefines how people see him without forcing that perception. It allows the audience to arrive at their own conclusions, which is far more powerful than telling them what to think. And as the conversation continues to evolve, more layers keep emerging. Discussions about creative independence, about long-term relevance, about the balance between public image and personal truth. All of these themes are now connected to this single moment, which shows just how much depth it carries. But perhaps the most important part of all this is what it represents on a human level. Beyond the headlines, beyond the analysis, beyond the speculation, it represents a decision. A decision to move forward in a way that feels right, even if it doesn't align with expectations. And that's something people understand, regardless of who they are or where they come from. Because everyone reaches a point where they have to choose between following a path that's already defined or creating one that feels more aligned with who they are becoming. This moment captures the choice perfectly. Not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a quiet, confident one. And sometimes, that kind of confidence speaks louder than anything else. And just when it seems like the full picture is starting to come together, there's still one more layer that hasn't been fully explored, a layer that could change how this entire announcement is understood, not just as a personal move, but as something that might influence the direction of the industry itself. And that final layer is where everything stops being just about one person and starts becoming something much bigger, because when you look closely at what Johnny Depp has actually done here, it's not just a personal decision, it's a signal. A signal that the traditional way of maintaining relevance, chasing visibility, and constantly staying in the spotlight is no longer the only path forward. What makes this even more interesting is how quietly that signal was delivered. There was no campaign built around it, no aggressive rollout, no attempt to dominate every platform at once. Instead, it spread organically, through people sharing it because they felt something, not because they were told to pay attention. And that kind of organic momentum is rare, especially at this scale. Industry observers started pointing out that this approach could reshape how established figures handle transitions in their careers. Instead of trying to compete with newer faces on speed and volume, it shows that there's value in stepping back, refining your direction, and then returning with something that actually reflects who you are now. And the timing plays a huge role here. Audiences today are more aware than ever. They can sense when something is forced, when something is purely strategic, and when something comes from a place of authenticity. This announcement falls into that last category, and that's why it's being received differently. Another key detail that adds weight to this moment is how consistent it is with his past mindset. This isn't a sudden change in personality or direction, it's an evolution. And evolution feels natural when you can trace it back through previous statements, previous decisions, previous patterns. Fans have already started doing that, connecting interviews from years ago to what's happening now, and the consistency is hard to ignore. One particularly discussed reference came from a past interview where he spoke about how the industry can sometimes push individuals into repeating versions of themselves that no longer feel real. He explained that staying true to your creative instincts often means stepping away from what's expected. At the time, it sounded like a general observation, but now it feels like a direct explanation of the path he has chosen. And then there's the influence factor. Whether intentional or not, this kind of move creates a ripple effect. Younger creators, independent artists, even established names who feel stuck in a cycle of repetition, they all see this and start questioning their own approach. Is there another way to do this? Is it possible to step away and still maintain impact? This moment suggests that the answer is yes. What's also worth noticing is how the narrative around him is changing, not because he asked for it to change, but because his actions are naturally shifting it. Instead of being defined by past headlines, he's creating new context, new conversations, new associations. And that's one of the most effective ways to redefine perception, not by addressing the past directly, but by building something that moves beyond it. Fans have been especially vocal about this shift. Many are saying that this feels like the most genuine version of him they've seen in years. Not because he's trying to appear different, but because he's no longer trying to fit into a specific image. That freedom is visible, even through a short announcement, and it's something people connect with instantly. And then there's the question everyone keeps coming back to: what happens next? Because as powerful as this announcement is, it's just the beginning. The real impact will come from how this direction unfolds over time, what kind of projects emerge, what kind of stories are told, what kind of collaborations take place. Some insiders have already hinted that the upcoming phase will focus heavily on creative control, with projects that prioritize storytelling over scale. If that turns out to be true, it could lead to a completely different kind of output, one that doesn't aim to please everyone, but instead aims to be meaningful to those who engage with it. And that shift in focus could redefine success itself. Instead of measuring it through numbers, visibility, or mainstream dominance, it could be measured through impact, through connection, through authenticity. And while that might sound like an abstract idea, moments like this bring it into reality. Another important aspect is how this changes the relationship between creator and audience. Instead of a one-sided dynamic where the audience simply consumes what's presented, it becomes more interactive, more thoughtful. People start paying attention not just to what is being released, but why it's being released, what it represents, what it says about the direction of the creator. And the deeper level of engagement is what keeps the conversation alive long after the initial announcement. It's not just a moment, it's an ongoing discussion, one that evolves as more information becomes available, as more actions follow, as more pieces of the puzzle fall into place. There's also a level of discipline in this approach that shouldn't be overlooked. Choosing not to overexpose, choosing not to respond to every reaction, choosing to let the message speak for itself, that requires confidence. And that confidence is what gives this moment its strength. Even from a strategic perspective, it's a powerful move. By avoiding over-explanation, it creates curiosity. By staying controlled, it builds anticipation. By focusing on authenticity, it strengthens connection. All of these elements work together in a way that feels natural, even though there's clearly a level of intention behind it. And as more time passes, the true impact of this announcement will become even clearer. Not just in terms of his own journey, but in terms of how others respond to it, how the industry adapts, how audiences continue to engage with content that feels real versus content that feels manufactured. Because at the end of the day, that's what this moment comes down to, real versus expected. And in choosing real, he has created something that stands out without trying to stand out. And that's why the internet reacted the way it did. Not just because of who said it, but because of how it was said, why it was said, and what it represents moving forward. This isn't just a headline, it's a shift, and shifts like this don't happen often, but when they do, they leave a mark that lasts far beyond the moment itself. And what makes that mark even more powerful is how it continues to grow even after the initial reaction fades, because now people aren't just replaying the announcement, they're watching what follows with a completely different level of attention. Every move, every appearance, every detail is being observed through a new lens, not of judgment, but of curiosity. And that shift in attention is exactly what turns a moment into momentum. With Johnny Depp, that momentum doesn't feel rushed, it feels controlled, almost like each step is placed carefully, without the need to overextend or overexplain. And that's something audiences are not used to seeing at this level. Usually, after a major announcement, there's a flood of content, interviews, appearances, and attempts to stay at the center of attention. But here, the opposite is happening, and somehow, that absence of noise is creating even more interest. People have started noticing small but meaningful details in his recent public interactions. The way he carries himself, the way he responds to questions, the way he avoids being pulled into unnecessary narratives. It all reflects a level of awareness that goes beyond surface-level decisions. It feels like someone who understands exactly how much to say and when to say it. One moment that gained traction involved a brief media exchange where he was asked about future plans. Instead of giving a detailed roadmap or making bold claims, he simply acknowledged that he's focusing on work that feels honest to him. That response, while simple, aligns perfectly with everything we've seen so far. And more importantly, it reinforces the idea that this direction isn't temporary, it's intentional. Another layer that continues to build is how audiences are now interpreting his past differently. Things that once seemed unclear or even contradictory are starting to make sense when viewed through this new perspective. It's like watching the same story but understanding it in a completely different way because now you have the missing context. This kind of recontextualization is rare, and it only happens when there's enough consistency between past and present to support it. In this case, that consistency is what's giving this moment its depth. It's not built on a single announcement, it's built on years of thoughts, choices, and experiences that are now coming together in a way that feels cohesive. And then there's the emotional connection, which continues to grow stronger. Fans aren't just supporting the announcement, they're connecting with what it represents. Many have shared their own experiences of stepping away from expectations, of choosing a different path, of redefining success on their own terms. And that shared experience is what turns a public moment into something personal for millions of people. It also explains why the reaction has been so sustained. Usually, viral moments peak quickly and then fade, but this one keeps evolving because it's tied to something deeper than just entertainment. It taps into a mindset, a feeling, a perspective that people relate to on a real level. At the same time, industry conversations are becoming more focused. Instead of speculating endlessly, analysts are now looking at potential outcomes, realistic scenarios, and long-term implications. There's a growing recognition that this approach, if maintained, could influence how future projects are developed and presented. Some insiders have pointed out that there's already interest in collaborating under this new direction, not because of hype, but because of the clarity it offers. When someone knows what they stand for and communicates it effectively, it naturally attracts the right kind of opportunities. And that's exactly what seems to be happening here. There's also an important shift in how success is being discussed. Instead of focusing solely on numbers or visibility, the conversation is expanding to include impact, authenticity, and creative satisfaction. And while those factors have always existed, they're now being brought to the forefront in a way that feels more relevant to today's audience. This shift doesn't happen overnight, but moments like this accelerate it. They create examples that people can point to, reference, and learn from. And over time, those examples start to shape expectations, not just for audiences, but for creators as well. Another interesting aspect is how this moment challenges the idea of timing. Traditionally, there's a belief that certain moves need to happen at specific stages of a career to be effective. But this announcement breaks that pattern. It shows that clarity and direction matter more than timing, and that meaningful shifts can happen at any point. And that realization opens up new possibilities, not just for one individual, but for anyone watching. It removes the pressure of following a fixed timeline and replaces it with the idea of moving when it feels right, when it aligns with who you are and where you want to go. As the story continues to unfold, one thing becomes increasingly clear. This isn't about reclaiming something that was lost, it's about redefining what comes next. And that distinction is important because it changes the entire narrative. It moves the focus away from the past and places it firmly on the future. And that future, while still taking shape, already feels different. Not louder, not bigger, but more focused, more intentional, more aligned. And in a world where so much content competes for attention, that kind of focus stands out in a way that doesn't need to be forced. People are starting to realize that this is what makes the announcement so impactful. It's not trying to compete, it's creating its own space. And in doing so, it's setting a new standard for what a meaningful return can look like. The conversation is still ongoing, the details are still emerging, and the full picture is still forming. But even at this stage, the effect is undeniable. Something shifted, not just in perception, but in possibility. And that's what makes this moment more than just news, it makes it a reference point for everything that comes after. If this moment hit you the same way it hit millions of others, then you already know this isn't just another headline, it's something real. And now I want to hear from you. Do you think Johnny Depp just changed the game, or is this only the beginning of something even bigger? Drop your thoughts below, because the conversation around this is only getting started. And if you want more stories that go beyond the surface, that actually break things down the right way, make sure you subscribe and stay locked in. Because what's coming next? You don't want to miss it.